Hello, my name is Shelton Woods, and I'm a professor of East and Southeast Asian history at Boise State University. Earlier in 2011, the Journal of Energy and Development published an article I wrote on China's growing need for oil. Teaching and research are the best part of the academician's world. My next book on the history of Vietnam is due to be published by the Association of Asian Studies in the spring of 2012. The following presentation is on China's recent economic ascent, and I hope you enjoy this lecture. Napoleon once said, "China is a sleeping dragon. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." He was right. Our generation has witnessed the phenomenally rapid emergence of China as a world power. Just in terms of economics, since 1978, China's economy has doubled every 8 years. During that same time period, the U.S. economy has doubled once. In terms of population, 1 out of every 8 human beings today is a Chinese peasant. Yet China has experienced the greatest migration in human history over the past 2 decades, as tens of millions of rural peasants have moved to China's eastern seaboard, hoping to find better opportunities. The most amazing aspect of China's waking is the hurdles it has had to clear over the past 150 years. Beginning in 1842, the Chinese experienced what they often term the century of great humiliation, because it was in 1842 that China lost the first of many wars to Western nations. Unfortunately for the Chinese, during the 19th century, as they were confronted by an industrialized West, they still believed that to find the answers to industrialization was to go back and read the writings of their ancient sages. So while the West looked forward, the Chinese continued to look back. It tried to fight off the West, but its first loss to British in 1842 in the so-called Opium War was just the beginning of China's many woes. Following the end of China's imperial system in 1912, 2 world wars, and a bloody civil war between 1946 and 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, emerged as the new hope for a humiliated China. So, on October 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong climbed the stage at Tiananmen Square to declare the establishment of the People's Republic of China, he said with great pride and emotion, "Comrades, the Chinese people have stood up." Unfortunately, Mao Zedong was excellent at being a revolutionary leader, but he was not very strong in terms of leading the economy. He was not an economist. Yet he had such a great view of his intellect and his ability to move China forward that he often put irrational policies in place. One of the first things that he and his colleagues did was to take everything in China, all private businesses, and make them state-owned enterprises. He moved the economy to what might be called an economy based on what the state decides needs to be made, taking away entrepreneurial activity. The economy was strictly controlled by the government. Private businesses were abolished, and the state-owned enterprises were supposed to be the engines to stimulate the economy. But when that didn't work, Mao began to rely on the hard work of the farmers to propel China to prosperity. All the while he held the belief that even in running a factory, it was more important to be a true communist than a well-educated technician. The slogan was, "It is better to be read than expert." This led to great disasters in China. Between 1959 and 1962, in a movement called the Great Leap Forward, over 30 million Chinese starved to death or died of related illnesses because of Mao's half-baked economic plans. While that was a failure, what followed was the disaster known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, when China almost lost its culture because Mao Zedong asked the students to destroy everything that reminded them of the past. Given these major difficulties, we should be amazed at what China has accomplished since Mao's death in 1976, because from the ashes of failed ideologies and policies, China has just recently been tagged as the second leading economy in the world behind the United States. How was China able to do this? What policies were put in place to change the way that China was going? Well, there are 4 things that we might keep in mind that help us understand China's economic ascent since 1976. After Mao's death, the Chinese decided that they wanted a leader that was a bit more progressive and one that looked to the economy rather than revolution as the answer. They chose a man named Deng Xiaoping, who was a colleague of Mao Zedong but who had been tortured during the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping, in a brilliant move, comes to the United States in February of 1979. This is just after Jimmy Carter in the United States recognizes the People's Republic of China officially on January 1st, 1979. After 30 years of being in existence, the U.S. recognizes it officially in early 1979. He comes to the United States, and rather than being an aloof emperor, Deng Xiaoping comes here and he's quite affable, and he is, in words that we would understand, blown away by what he sees in the United States. He's amazed at the prosperity, the technology that he finds here. He goes to Houston and looks at the space program and is wowed by what he sees and experiences. And he goes back to China, and he says that, in a very famous saying, that, you know, it really doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black. If it catches a mouse, then it is a good cat. And what he was saying there is, it doesn't matter too much whether we have a controlled economy or a free market system. Whatever works is what the Chinese should use. And so the first important decision that helped China's economy was to be more flexible in its economic policies. And this led many foreign companies to come to China to try and set up businesses in China. Cities on the eastern seaboard of China became known as special economic zones, where Chinese could be entrepreneurial and could open their own businesses, and joint ventures with foreign companies could take place. So that was helpful. The second policy that was helpful was that China avoided what some call the Big Bang approach to changing. That is, at this same time in the 1980s, the Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union in Europe, they were going through changes as well. But the differences between what China was doing and what the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries were doing was that China decided, we cannot change both the economy and the political system at the same time. We've got to focus on one. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union approached change by the Big Bang approach. That is, we're going to change everything. We're going to change the economy. We're going to change the political system. And so what you see happening in Europe is the destruction, the end, in essence, of communism. Because as it tried to change its economy, it also tried to change its political system. China says no. We're just going to change the economic system, but the political system is going to stay in place. And that helps us understand what happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989 when the students revolted, because the students wanted not just economic changes, they also wanted political changes. NPR correspondent Rob Gifford, in his new book China Road, notes that once you start giving people the choice of whether to have pepperoni on your pizza or not, which the Chinese have that choice now, they're going to also want to start to choose their government. But because of the importance of an authoritarian state in the Confucian idea, the Chinese politicians were able to change the economic system while keeping the political system in place. So that was the second thing that changed, the fact that they decided we will only change the economy, not the political system. The third thing that they had to deal with, which was a little bit more controversial, was Deng Xiaoping understood that if China is going to become a great power, the only way we're going to be able to do this is by doing something about our population. Now, China's population has been big historically. I mean, in the very first century, the Han Dynasty in China had a population of 60 million people out of a world population of 200 million people. So they had 1/4 of humanity. In 1850, China's population was an estimated 450 million out of a world's population of 1.2 billion people. That is, almost 1/3 of the world, if not more, was made up of Chinese. And one of the reasons for China's explosion of the population in the 19th century was that the last dynasty of China, which is known as the Qing dynasty, which lasted from 1644 to 1912, well, at the beginning of the Qing dynasty, they had 3 very effective emperors that together these 3 emperors ruled for 150 years. You know, in the United States, we have to change our president. We have to have elections every 4 years. Well, if you can imagine having the 3 strongest presidents the United States has ever had rule for a combined 150 years, you could see how that might bring some stability to a nation. Because of that, China's population increased. And then when Mao Zedong comes along in the 1950s and 1960s, he's encouraging Chinese to have more children because his rather irrational view was, if we're going to get into a nuclear war, let's just have more people than the West, and that way a lot of us will die, but there will be some that will survive. At any rate, in 1979 and 1980, Deng Xiaoping and his advisors looked over China and they said, we have got to do something about our population if we're going to become economically sound. And so a policy was put in place called the one-child policy. This policy stated that every woman was allowed to just have one child. Every man was to sire only one child. And by that way, the hope was that by the year 2050, maybe the population of China would stabilize. Right now, in the year 2011, there's about 1.4 billion Chinese. And the hope is to get down to something like 900 million by the year 2050. Now, China is not the first Asian country to do this. If you look at Japan, Japan did this actually twice. A period in Japanese history called Tokugawa Japan between 1600 and 1868. The population remained stable during that time, and the Japanese economy grew during that period. And the same thing happens to the Japanese after World War II. They make sure that their population doesn't grow too fast so that its economy could recover. One of the differences, however, between Japan and China is that the Chinese really wanted male children. If you were a couple in China, your preference would be to have a son rather than a daughter. Historically in China, eternal life was synonymous with having a son, someone to carry on your name and to revere you when you were gone. And so because of that, China's population has stabilized, but there's some problems. Currently in China, for every 118 men in China, there are only 100 women. And that, that's going to create major social upheaval in China in the future. Nonetheless, the government was so strong, and the authoritarian idea of Confucianism was so embedded in the Chinese that they were able to put this law in place so that China's population stabilized, and that has helped its economy as well. And then there's this fourth thing, and perhaps the most important thing. Deng Xiaoping and his advisors decided that what we need to do is we need to loosen the reins on the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese, which is very strong, and make it so that state-owned enterprises are not the only factories that are in China. That is to say, we need to give individuals an opportunity to make money. So this is what starts to happen. Let's take a village, for example. There's a village, and in the village there's a factory there, and what they make in that factory are shirts. And so it's a state-owned enterprise. The villagers, if they're not working on their rice paddies, they go to the state-owned enterprise and they work together to make shirts. Now, here's the deal. In the state-owned enterprise, everybody is going to get paid the same amount no matter how much is produced. So we could go and work and produce 50 shirts and spend the rest of the day sitting around just talking, and we're not going to get paid any more or any less for how much we make. Well, the government says we're going to allow individuals and groups of individuals to start their own companies. These are called township village enterprises. And what happens is that, let's say we're still in this village that has a state-owned enterprise making shirts. Well, there might be some entrepreneurs in that village that get together some money, and maybe that money comes from relatives that they have living in Southeast Asia or in Hong Kong or in Taiwan. At any rate, they get some money, and with that money they create a new factory that also makes shirts. And so once that happens, inside of a village, you now have three options of how to make a living. One is you can go out and farm, which most of the people in rural China do. You can work for the state-owned enterprise, or you can now work for this new township village enterprise, this new almost private property that is in the village. Now, what is a little bit surprising is that the salaries in the state-owned enterprises were actually higher than the salaries in these new township village factories, these township village enterprises. So what would make an individual in a village go and work in a private factory when their salary would be less, and they would have to actually work harder than working in the state-owned enterprise or working in the rice paddy? Well, what starts to happen, of course, is these privately owned factories start getting rich, and the returns are up to 40% a year. And that means there are bonuses at the end of the year. And this starts to change the whole system in China, so that state-owned enterprises, which are not viable, which they are not making money, slowly they begin to shut down, and they are replaced by these individually owned factories. And there are many, many wonderful stories of how these township village enterprises begin to change not just the village's economy, but the world's economy. Let me give you just one quick example. In 1980, there were three brothers walking down the street in Zhejiang province. And they saw, I believe it was a rainy night, they saw to the side of the gutter a little shiny thing, and they picked it up, and lo and behold, they found a little button. And so they thought to themselves, why don't we start a township village enterprise making buttons? I mean, everybody needs buttons, right? We need buttons for our shirts. Sometimes we need buttons for our pants. Everybody needs buttons. Let's start with that. That was 1980. Now in Chiotao, in Zhejiang province, there are 700 family-run factories making buttons. And how many buttons do they make? They make 60% of the world's buttons and zippers. 50,000 migrant workers have come to this town, now a city, just to make buttons. There's a wonderful new book by Peter Hessler called China Road. And in that book, Peter Hessler looks at a village that has been transformed into a large city because they begin making little bra rings, the little metal rings that are needed in bras. And so we start to see that China completely changes economically because it opens up to the world because of Deng Xiaoping's policies. It keeps its population at a level that will not mean that all the extra money that we're making are going to pay for all of our children. And it begins to plug into the world's economy. It's simply amazing what China has been able to do since 1976. And they've been able to do it because of that spirit of the Chinese that goes back for centuries.